Good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. The Bible Hour. And the President has said that means I speak for 59 minutes and 59 seconds exactly, so that's the plan. Resurrection cold case. Are there any facts for us as it were, armchair detectives? And I've kind of decided to look at the resurrection in that way. It isn't being frivolous, it's just in one sense a slightly different perspective. We're going to attempt to investigate this crime scene. Why? If the resurrection is a ruse or a hoax or not true, it is a crime. If so, who is guilty? To many, the resurrection is fake, just a story. That makes it an even greater crime. 1 Corinthians 15, then faith is a waste of time and we have all been duped. In terms of a crime, one tends to think of who, what, where, and why. So this ancient death scene is the basis of our hour. What happened to Jesus 2,000 years ago? How do we explain the empty tomb? Did the disciples steal the body? Were the soldiers bribed or corrupt? We're going to examine the scene from historical accounts and the Bible, whereby we have a rich body of evidence. But I want you to start with an open mind, not a closed one. An open mind. That's what a detective does. A homicide detective and a cold case investigation assesses the following facts. And for those of you in the land of Zoom, I've given everybody a little sheet with the following facts. The truth must be feasible. Consider alibis of potential suspects, eliminating the impossible based on confirmed alibis. The truth will be usually straightforward. I look for the man or woman who most simply accounts for the evidence. The truth should be exhaustive. The explanation displays explanatory depth. The suspect who accounts for most or all of the evidence is the killer. The truth must be logical. The truth is rational. The identity of the killer must also make sense. The truth will be superior. This particular suspect is a far better choice when compared to other offered candidates. All those boxes ticked, we have the killer, we have the answer. So let's imagine we are detectives. We've got an ancient crime scene. This death scene, a topic of 2,000 years of discussion. So key questions. What happened to Jesus? How do we explain the empty tomb? Did the disciples steal the body? Did he actually die and was he resurrected, as it were? Did he rise to life from the dead, having been 3 days dead? Fact or fiction? What was the motive? Sounds like a fun thriller. It's actually a great deal more. We can approach these from a detective-like perspective, using abductive reasoning. So abductive reasoning is logical reasoning that seeks the most likely conclusion from a set of observations. Logical reasoning, that means I can understand it, that's the plan. Essentially making a probable conclusion from what you know. Okay, facts accepted by researchers in the field, claims by friend and foes of Christianity, believers and non-believers. 1. Jesus died on the cross and was buried. Jesus' tomb was empty and no one produced a body. Jesus' disciples believed that they saw Jesus resurrected from the dead. Jesus' disciples were transformed following the alleged resurrection observations. Facts accepted by friends or foe, as it were, of Christianity. Are you with me so far? Okay, those of you in the land of Zoom, everybody's nodding in perfect agreement. What about two? Okay. I've got a bit of a sheet here, and I'm going to run through 7 areas. Okay, and that's more of a prompt for me. The disciples were wrong about Jesus' death. The disciples lied about the resurrection, area number 2. Number 3, the disciples were delusional. Number 4, the disciples were fooled by an imposter. Number 5, the disciples were influenced by limited spiritual sightings. Number 6, the disciples, it's my writing. The disciples' observations were distorted later. And number 7, the disciples were accurately reporting the resurrection of Jesus. So those are the 7 areas I'm going to look at. 55 more minutes to go, Brother Speaker. The disciples were wrong about Jesus' death. Skeptics suggest that the disciples were mistaken about Jesus' death, proposing Jesus survived the beatings, the torture and crucifixion, and appeared after his recovery. Problem. In death, what do we see in terms of a body? A. Warmth is lost. The body feels cold to touch. Chemical reactions take place in muscles after death, resulting in what? A stiffening and rigidity of the body. Rigor mortis. You've all seen the crime sort of ditties. So rigor mortis. This stiffness is noted by the body retaining the position they were in when they died. Clear, objective scientific fact. Lastly, the heart stops. Blood pools responding to gravity. In essence, the body looks different and behaves differently from a living one. They don't flinch or respond to injuries. For those who removed Jesus from the cross, took his body, and they spent time treating it and wrapping him for burial, they would have noticed these signs of death, especially if they were not there. Also, the Gospels reported that he was stabbed by a soldier on the cross. In addition, consider yourself a detective and note the following problems. Many 2nd century unfriendly, as it were, Roman sources, Thallus, Tacitus, and others, even Josephus and the Babylonian Talmud, affirmed and acknowledged that Jesus was crucified and died. 1. The Roman guards, they faced death if they allowed a prisoner to survive crucifixion. Would they release a living man from the cross? Jesus would have had to control his blood loss from those beatings, from the crucifixion and stabbing in order to survive. But he was pinned to the cross and unable to do anything that might survive this. He displayed wounds following the resurrection, but was never observed to behave as though he was wounded. He appeared days after his beatings, crucifixion, torture, and stabbings. Jesus disappeared from historical record following his resurrection and ascension, and was not seen again, as one would or might expect if he'd recovered from his wounds. A 30-year-old man, what would he do? Continue living. The disciples lied about the resurrection. Some non-Christians claim that the disciples stole the body from the grave and later fabricated stories of Jesus' resurrection appearances. Issues. It may explain the empty tomb and resurrection observations, but it fails to explain the transformed lives of the apostles. A large conspiracy theory over time with a lot of people, with lots of parts, will unravel. Success in a conspiracy theory is best achieved by what? A short period of time and few people, especially when nothing is gained by their effort. This theory means that we have to believe that the apostles were transformed. They were emboldened not by the miraculous appearances of the resurrected Jesus, but by elaborate created lies with no benefit to them. Note in our reading, Matthew chapter 27, verses 62 to 66, the Jewish authorities took many precautions to make sure the tomb was guarded and sealed. The tomb was sealed and guards put there. The people local to the event would have known it was a lie. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, one that is regularly looked at in reference to this. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8. The resurrection of Jesus. For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance. It's Paul's epistle from the New International Version. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, and then to the 12. You say, okay, might be a slightly biased, dodgy lot. After that, he appeared to more than 500 people, more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. There were 500 who had seen Jesus. And at the time that was written, you could have gone over and said, hey, John, you saw Jesus, didn't you? Yes. 500. Who would testify that Jesus was alive after his resurrection. The disciples, how could their transformed lives as courageous evangelists be based on a lie? Would you die for a lie? Andrew, it said, was crucified in Patras, Greece. Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel, was flayed to death with a whip in Armenia. James the Just was thrown from the temple, then beaten to death in Jerusalem. James the Greater was said to be beheaded in Jerusalem. John died in exile in Patmos. Luke was hanged in Greece. Mark was dragged by a horse until he died in Alexandria in Egypt. Matthew was killed by a sword in Ethiopia. Matthias was stoned and then beheaded in Jerusalem. Peter was crucified upside down in Rome. Philip was crucified in Phrygia. Thomas was stabbed to death with a spear in India. They were first-hand witnesses of Jesus' resurrection. They knew if the claims were true or false. They didn't trust others for their testimony. They were making first-hand assertions. If their claims of the resurrected Jesus were a lie, they would know. We might die for a mistaken belief, faith, as it were. But it's unreasonable to believe that these men died for what they definitely knew to be untrue. I hope you're still with me. The disciples, area number 3, were delusional. Some skeptics believe with the intensity of grief and sorrow at Jesus' death, the disciples imagined seeing Jesus alive after his death on the cross. These skeptics claim his appearance was simply wishful thinking. There are some problems. It fails to explain the empty tomb. and only accounts for the resurrection experiences at first glance. Detectives note witnesses who are severely affected by death can and do see an experience through the lens of empathy, reducing the negative or bad aspects of an individual, seeing only their positives. David and the death of Saul. David describes Saul as a jolly lovely chap. Quite the opposite. We all have a tendency to think the best of people once they have died. These tend to be limited to the character of the individual and not the real minutiae of who they've been and are. But for loved ones who have all collectively imagined exactly identical sets of fictional events involving the victim, it's one thing remembering with fondness, another to imagine an elaborate, detailed history to the letter, with such consistency that didn't even occur. Concerns read the disciples and these hallucinations. Hallucinations are, as it were, an individual experience, yes, but there are no examples of large groups of people experiencing such events. So it's not something that one sees, having the exact same hallucination. Short memory hallucinations may appear reasonable. Long, detailed, sustained ones are not supported historically and is intuitively unreasonable. The risen Jesus was reportedly seen by others on more than one occasion, different groups, subsets of groups. All these various sightings would also have to be additional group hallucinations of one nature or another. Individuals walking to Emmaus, the 500, we've just seen referred to in Corinthians, Peter, the apostles, and more. Not all disciples, one would imagine, were inclined to hallucinations. Thomas, doubting Thomas, will come back to me a little bit later, slightly sceptical. Unless I see your hands, your side, I'm not going to believe. Luke, the doctor. If the resurrection was simply an hallucination, what became of his body? The absence of the body is unexplained in this scenario. The disciples were fooled by an imposter. Some believers argue that an imposter tricked the disciples and convinced them that Jesus was still alive, and the disciples unknowingly advanced that lie. Problem. While it may account for the resurrection observations and transformed disciples, it requires an additional set of conspirators, other than the apostles, who were later fooled. So, fraud and sort of forgery crime. In successful con artist crime, there are key aspects to its success. So, going to con somebody, etc. Victims are fooled out of money, etc., because they know less to nothing, read the subject area, okay, where they are being conned. So I'm going to chat away to my president here. There's an offshore account in Saudi Arabia, and you give me some money and we can earn millions tomorrow. Excellent. I fooled the president. Excellent. Bitcoin, etc. The basis being we don't know that much about it. The baddie uses sophisticated language outside the victim's expertise. The crook sounds legitimate. However, when the targeted victims know more about the subject than the con artist, the odds are good that the perpetrator will fail. For this reason, the proposal that the first century con artist fooled the disciples, all 12, seems unreasonable. the impersonator would have to be familiar enough of Jesus' mannerisms, statements, to fool or to convince the disciples, all the disciples. They'd spent 3 years, as it were, with Jesus. The disciples knew Jesus, the topic of the con, as it were, better than anyone. They'd spent 3 years with him. Many of the disciples were sceptical and displayed none of the necessary naivety necessary for the con artist to succeed. Thomas. The perpetrator would need to be someone motivated to impersonate Jesus other than the disciples, also able to perform miracles. Astounding miracles to convince them. Who would really look to start a world religious movement if not one of the disciples? The theory requires, as it were, it requires a skill and scale so vast as to be just unreasonable. The explanation also fails to explain the empty tomb or the missing body of Jesus. The disciples were influenced by limited spiritual sightings. Skeptics have offered the theory that 1 or 2 of the disciples were given a vision of the risen Jesus, then convinced the others that these spiritual sightings were legitimate, that they were real. Problem. It may appear to explain the transformation in the disciples, but it doesn't explain the empty tomb and offers an explanation of the resurrection inconsistent with the record of the Bible. It's not unusual to have a persuasive witness who influences others. These witnesses often have a better detailed account than those they have convinced. The convinced generalize and rely or refer to the persuader. The president knows. We don't know enough, but the president knows. The persuader is the most and only robust witness relating to the true story. The persuader may convince some of the witnesses, but not all. The more witnesses involved in the crime, the less likely that all of them would be convinced. We've got 500 and then some. The persuader, the key witness, can they really convince all witnesses, regardless of how charismatic they are? Concerns a selected number of persuaders convincing the disciples of the resurrection. The theory fails to acknowledge or recognise the numerous divergent and separate group sightings of Jesus recorded in the Gospels. It's not reasonable to believe that all the disciples could provide such detail if they were simply repeating something they didn't see. It's not reasonable to believe a persuader could equally persuade all these disciples, even though they didn't actually see anything that was recorded. The disciples' observations were distorted later. Some claim that the original observations of the disciples were amplified and distorted as the legend grew over time. These skeptics believe that Jesus may have been a wise teacher, arguing the resurrection is a legend and historically became later exaggerated, became an exaggeration. It may account for the empty tomb if we assume the body was moved. Time has passed from the original crime scene, so to speak, so witnesses can amplify their claims in many ways. However, we've got the records of first investigators separating what witnesses really saw and reported at the scene. If original investigation is sound and well documented, even with the passage of time, it will be easier to discern the truth from the accounts of these witnesses. First-hand statements are usually more detailed. Those who were there, Their accounts are more detailed and reliable than they might seem. Cold case investigators rely on original reports and compare what witnesses once said to what witnesses are saying today. The reliability of eyewitnesses' accounts related to the resurrection, like the reliability of a cold case eyewitness accounts, must be confirmed by early documentation. The earliest accounts of the disciples cite the resurrection of Jesus as their primary evidence that Jesus was the Son of God. Students of the disciples also recorded that the resurrection was a key part of the disciples' witness testimony. John, the youngest disciple, said to have lived from AD 6 to AD 100, son of Zebedee and Salome and brother of Jesus, it appeared he lived 94 years approximately and died a natural death. He taught two important students, Ignatius, Theophorus. He was a student of John and became the Bishop of Antioch. He wrote several letters still in existence today, also to another individual, Polycarp. They reveal the influence of John. He referred to New Testament documents, referring to the nature of Jesus. And his letter contains these portrayals of Jesus. And I'm just going to go to a snippet of them. In his letters, he highlights Jesus was of the line of David. He was conceived by the Holy Spirit. A star announced his birth. He was the perfect man. He was a source of wisdom. He spoke the words of God. He died on the cross. He suffered and was crucified. The disciples were convinced by the resurrection appearances. The disciples were fearless after seeing the risen Christ. There were actually quite a few statements in these letters, which I've only touched on a few. He knew the disciples, mentioning them frequently. The letters demonstrated the New Testament claims and writings existed early in history. Paul's students, the Apostle Paul, followed the same theme. The earliest Christian creeds, oral traditions, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, include resurrection as a key component. These were and are consistent. So we're not seeing a distortion. We are seeing consistency. One might look at different accounts from different individuals, different disciples. And there are differences, but the differences are consistent with looking at different angles, different locations. The narrative is the same. So the disciples' observations were not distorted. I hope you're still with me. I know I've gone on. So the disciples were wrong about Jesus' death. The disciples lied about the resurrection. The disciples were delusional. The disciples were fooled by an imposter. The disciples were influenced by limited spiritual sightings. The disciples, their observations were distorted later. And then there's the last area. The disciples were accurately reporting the resurrection of Jesus. Christians would say that Jesus rose from the dead, and the Gospels are accurate eyewitness accounts. Problem. The Bible accounts for the empty tomb, the resurrection observations, and the transformation of the disciples. It would be naive to accept these explanations, not recognizing that it has a liability that has to be examined and voiced by skeptics and non-believers. That Jesus rose from the dead prevents the following concerns and objections. It requires a belief in God, a belief that Jesus had the power to rise from the dead in the first place. The evidence was based on 4 modest claims. Jesus died and was buried. The tomb was empty. The disciples claimed to see Jesus resurrected. The disciples were transformed. If we enter the investigation without a pre-existing bias, then we have to pause, because it means that the disciples were accurately reporting the resurrection of Jesus. And they, in this account, for all the evidence, most simply and exhaustively, in terms of logic and consistency, it happened. It means we have to allow for the existence of God in the first place. The final explanation is far superior to all the other 6 areas. It doesn't suffer from all the problems we see in terms of if, but, or maybe, or problem here or problem there. Approaching the resurrection without a previous bias or presumption means that we look at it as a crime scene. We judge the possible explanations. We eliminate those that are unreasonable. The conclusion that Jesus was resurrected, as reported in the Gospels, can be reasonably or even sensibly inferred from the evidence, and resurrection is reasonable. Got my magic sheet of paper. Almost there. Abductive reasoning and the resurrection. Faith. Blind belief. No. Faith, Bible-based faith, is a well-placed, reasonable inference based on evidence. There is a caveat. With respect for evidence, we can explore the evidence of the Bible and conclude that Christianity is true. Not everyone's going to accept that, and I totally agree, and I can understand the logic of that. Evidence should be interpreted. There are many conclusions, and there is a degree of evidence. But ultimately, there's never enough evidence. We could do with just a bit more. That gap relies on faith. John chapter 14 and verse 11. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me, or at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Jesus provided much evidence, many miracles in his time. And it was enough for people. Thomas, John chapter 20 and verse 29. Jesus said to Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. Blessed are those who believe without seeing me. Jesus understood and valued evidence. See that in the miracles he performed. They present a stepping stone, as it were, to faith. But he also recognized evidence is not enough. We need faith too. There will never be enough evidence. There is just an insufficient amount of evidence. If so, faith would just be a computer program and be worthless. But evidence that our Heavenly Father has given us is a stepping stone to faith. Why? Because that stepping stone helps us on to develop faith. I hope our journey of faith can begin this afternoon.